Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as director of both the library in Ann Arbor and the museum here in Grand Rapids. We're glad to have you here on what is a harbinger of spring. Southeast Michigan had 5 to 8 inches of snow yesterday, and for once, Grand Rapids didn't get it, and so I was really, really pleased. Tonight is a special program, a prelude to Mrs. Ford's birthday tomorrow, and it's a great pleasure for us to have Bess Abell, Maria Downs, and Laurie Firestone with us tonight. Their intimate knowledge of the White House will bring our feature exhibit, The White House in Miniature, to life. We're also honored to have with us Rick Albin of 24 Hour News 8, who has graciously agreed to moderate this esteemed panel. Lyndon Johnson once said of Bess Abell that she was the only person I know who can do something at the last moment and have it turn out like she had all the time in the world. Ms. Abell was the assistant to Lady Bird Johnson during the vice presidential period from 1961 to 1963. Then she became White House Social Secretary from 1963 to 69, a very long tenure. During those years, Ms. Abell presided over 18 official state visits and many, many more informal visits of diplomatic guests. And Bess Abell is the lovely lady in the turquoise, the first of our spring beauties tonight. Maria Downs is the lovely lady in hot pink tonight. They didn't plan this, or at least they didn't tell me about it at any rate, but I think it's great. Maria Downs worked with Betty Ford. Betty Ford, as you may know, inherited a lot of Pat Nixon's staff at the White House when she became First Lady. In time, though, Mrs. Ford replaced some of the staff with those of her choosing, and Maria Downs was one of those chosen. Maria served as Social Secretary from October 1975 until the end of the Ford administration in early of 77. According to Mrs. Ford, Maria, quote, had an eagle eye when it came to spotting a wallflower and dispatching an aide to ask the person to dance. In 1980, Vice President George H.W. Bush and his wife Barbara selected Laurie Firestone to take on the role of Social Secretary for the Vice President's office. Later, in 1988, Ms. Firestone was named White House Social Secretary by the President and Mrs. Bush. The First family loved to entertain, hosting an astonishing 40,000 people annually at events ranging from state dinners to backyard barbecues. And of course, Laurie is the lady in purple today. In addition to being a social secretary and having a distinguished career, as all three of our ladies have, Laurie is also an author. And out in the lobby, you'll have a chance to take her book called An Affair to Remember, State Dinners for Home Entertaining, which is a wonderful collection of photos from the Bush administration and selected recipes. And it's really a beautiful book to look at, and if you like to cook, it's going to be great fun. So this is my copy. Thank you so much. Many of you know Rick Albin, a face familiar to us here in West Michigan and a great friend both of the Ford family and of us at the museum. Rick is the political reporter for 24 Hour News 8. Over his career, he has interviewed a dozen presidential candidates, including a one-on-one session with George W. Bush. Rick is personable and always well prepared as an interviewer, so we expect great things tonight.
Oh, sure.
I could tell you a great deal more about each of our speakers, but I know that you would rather hear from them than me. But before we invite them to open our program, I'd like to read a personal letter to our speakers from Mrs. Betty Ford. Dear Maria, Bess, and Laurie, thank you so much for your willingness to travel to Grand Rapids to speak at the Ford Presidential Museum in honor of my birthday. You are definitely the best people I know to provide an insider's look at the White House. Each of you will have wonderful stories to share from your time working with Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Bush, or me, and I know the attendees will be delighted with the program. You honor me by your long friendship and your gracious agreement to speak at the museum. Thank you for all your recognition and celebration of my 91st birthday. And signed with warmest regards, Betty Ford. And we have copies for each of you as well, or original. So now let's turn things over to Rick, Laurie, Bess, and Maria to kick off a wonderful celebration in honor of Mrs. Ford's 91st birthday tomorrow.
All right, thank you, Elaine. Thanks very much. And it took no convincing to get me here. I do like to be prepared when I come to these, but I want to tell you I am overmatched tonight. We were just in the back, and I was talking to these three lovely ladies. You know, I thought about this morning. I thought, how many times do reporters say, if the walls could talk? Well, they're a lot better looking than walls, but they can talk. Now the question is, will they? We'll find out tonight. In thinking about the amazing amount of history that each of you has viewed, it is hard to know where to begin, but I'd like to start with some basics if we could, because for me, I have a basic idea of what you do, but I'd like you to give me a description of what your job was in the White House, because I would imagine it varies a bit to bit from administration to administration. So, Ms. Abell, I'll begin with you. How would you define your job during the time in the White House with Mrs. Johnson?
Well, I tell you, it's the best job in the White House to start with. And I loved working for the Johnsons, because if you did something that the president liked, you didn't have to wait to hear about it from the third assistant secretary somewhere. You heard about it from the man. And he frequently would go overboard on that. He was on a campaign stop in my home state of Kentucky, and he really got carried away. And he said, there's this really great woman who's in my administration back in Washington. She's just the hardest working person, and she's the smartest person in my administration, and she should be in the cabinet. So on the other side of that, you might get a call from it. I did get a call from it in preparation for his youngest daughter Lucy's wedding. And he said, if there's was a mistake to be made on this wedding and you haven't thought of it, and you haven't made it, it's because you didn't think of it. In this particular case, it had to do with Lucy's wedding dress. And David Dubinsky, sorry, I have a very thin voice. It'll probably give out on me. But David Dubinsky was a wonderful man, and he was head of the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And he had come to see the president with tears in his eyes, saying, all my ladies are so distressed because Lucy's wedding dress is being made in the non-union shop. Well, the president was furious with me. He said, how could you let this happen? Everything Lady Bird's worn for 30 years has had a union label in it. I said, well, we will fix it somehow. It was being made by Priscilla of Boston, who made lovely dresses, lovely wedding dresses and bridesmaids' dresses. And I called Priscilla and explained the problem, and she said, not to worry, I have a friend who makes bridal dresses, and she has union workers, and we will make, she will make a dress too, and we will ship both dresses to Lucy, and which dress she wears is up to her. Well, I thought we might as well snip the ILGWU label out of one dress and put it in Lucy's dress. And I always sort of considered that as something borrowed.
So did you?
Being the social secretary was a mix of things.
Ms. Downs.
Well, more on the serious side. We were actually charged with handling all of the presidents, first ladies, and families, social events, personal events, anything that went on in the White House. It covered a very large scope, which many of you may be familiar with. Your throat is spreading.
I'm sorry. I won't breathe on you.
Including state dinners and regular dinners, which could have been something like the Medal of Freedom dinner, the Judiciary dinner. We had a lot of diplomatic affairs, and everyone says, well, you people were just party people. But no, the administration and President Ford counted on us to help him get across a lot of the business that he wanted, and I think there was more business conducted than socializing at a lot of these events. But the funny thing is, one day, Mrs. Ford, out of the clear blue sky, said to me, Maria, do you know what job I would like to have if I weren't First Lady? I thought, oh, she has a great sense of humor, as many of you probably know. And I said, well, can't be Vice President. The president won't stand for that. And she looked at me and she said, all right, smarty. She said, I'd like to have your job. And I said, well, I said, I can understand that, because she was so into everything that we did. I mean, every little detail that went into the dinner. Not that she was micromanaging or anything. She was just interested in it and had a lot of wisdom that I at that time did not have. I always said she babysat me through my term as Social Secretary. But she said, pardon?
Okay.
Am I doing something wrong?
No, you're right. Just
Okay.
speak up just a little.
I always said she babysat me through my term as a Social Secretary. But I said, what makes you want to be Social Secretary? And she said, she said, do you remember Fred Allen? And I said, yes, he was the late Fred Allen. He was a comedian. And she said, well, your job kind of reminds me of something. Your job kind of reminds me of something that Fred Allen said years ago about love. And I said, oh? And she said, yes, love makes the world go round. And she took a pause and said, with a worried expression. And so many times when things really got hectic and stuff, she'd send somebody over and she'd say, tell Fred to do this, that, or the other. So it was kind of a standing joke between us. But it's a very, very, very serious and very important job that she loved. She really did. And she would have been one hell of a Social Secretary.
Ms. Firestone.
Well, Whitehouse Social Secretary is sort of not really the correct name for what we did, I think, for all of us. You don't do secretarial work. I mean, you're not sitting there doing, a calendar or writing notes. You're doing everything. As Bess said, it's the most exciting, the most unique, the most fun job of being in the White House. And in my particular case with the Bushes, it not only entailed planning and executing all the events at the White House, but also any events that they hosted outside the White House. So consequently, I traveled all over the world with them because, as you will recall, Bush loved the diplomacy and meeting with the different presidents and leaders of several countries. And we went there, we entertained them at the White House. And then on the other hand, I did things like Doro Bush's wedding up at Camp David, or I would go up to New York with Barbara and look for clothes. And so the job encompasses a lot of things, and I think each social secretary is called upon to do a wide range of things, and it just, there is no real set job description.
And it changes from administration to administration.
Absolutely, whatever
the needs
that president and first lady need.
There are a lot of people in the audience wondering, how the heck do you get that job? Let's start with you, because it has to be a little different path. They don't post this in the Washington Post.
No.
Or maybe they do, I don't know, never looked.
No, and certainly there is no straight course to it, and lots of young girls, because I have young children, and their friends, I want to do that job, how do I do it? Well, it's difficult. You can't take a few courses at the university and say, okay, I'm ready to be White House Social Secretary. In my particular case, I met the Bushes through, before they, when actually he was campaigning or starting his campaign for president in the late 70s. And I got, through mutual friends, got to know them and was involved. And then after he was elected, or after Reagan chose him to be the vice president, and then they were elected, I went back to our mutual friend, who was Dean Birch, head of the FCC, and said, you know, I would love to work for the Bushes in the vice presidents, and here's what I could do. And I sort of laid out a job description of what I thought they would need. And he said, you know, that's exactly what we think they do need. And we've actually discussed this. And are you sure you want to get into politics? Because prior to that, I hadn't been. And I said, oh, yeah. You know, by now, I had lived in Washington long enough, and Washington's all about politics and relationships, and it's exciting, and I thought there couldn't be anything more wonderful than to be involved. So he said, great, I'll set up the interview, and the rest is history.
Ms. Downs, how did you end up in this position? You worked at the Bicentennial Commission, is that right?
Not really.
No,
We had, thank you. We had an awful lot of involvement in the bicentennial because the Fords were in the White House then. I had known both President and Mrs. Ford, but not really well, and was serving in the Nixon White House. And when President Nixon resigned and President Ford moved into the spot, I was still wrapping up some things that we had done. I was working for Anne Armstrong, actually. She was the counselor to President Nixon and later became his ambassador, President Ford's ambassador to Great Britain. But we were wrapping up things in the bicentennial office, and a friend of mine called and said, Maria, Mrs. Ford is looking for a social secretary. And I said, oh, okay. I thought he was calling to ask me to recommend people. And I said, I'll get back to you. Give me a couple of days to think about this. And he said, oh, no. He said, I'm talking about you. And I said, oh, come on. Thank you very much, but I just am not the person for that job. And he said, well, that's too bad because your name's in the hopper. A short time after that, I received a call from Mrs. Ford's secretary asking me if I wanted the position, wanted to be interviewed for it, and if I were willing to come up and have an interview. And I said, you betcha. And I went up, and that was the first of 3 interviews, and each of the interviews lasted 3 hours. She knew exactly what she wanted. She had been without a social secretary for a while. Actually, she did one of the most important dinners that has been held in the White House in many years, when Emperor Hirohito came to the country. It was the first emperor to visit. And she just, as I said, she knew exactly what she wanted and what she was looking for. And when the emperor's dinner came along, she had decided, she called me and said, I would be very happy, and so would the president, if you would be our social secretary. And I, of course, said, yes, I would be too. And my husband wasn't so happy, and my horse was less happy. But anyhow, to make a very long story short, that year was just a miraculous year. It started off with the emperor's visit, which, as I said, she did mostly by herself. So that shows you, again, what a good social secretary she would have been. But also, we had, I guess it started with, after the emperor, the Queen of England. We had the King of Spain, the President of France, the Chancellor of Germany, the King of Spain, and it went on and on and on. And we had, I don't know how many state dinners. Usually you don't do that many because it's a very time-consuming, very difficult thing to do. But she was just remarkable, and I think she came up, and maybe in later questions I don't want to hold up on this question, but she came up with an awful lot of innovations because it was our birthday And she was so proud of America and everything that we had here. But it was all that First Lady.
We will talk about the individual style, but I'm interested in how a young woman from Kentucky gets into a Texas White House.
How about that?
Yeah.
This girl from Kentucky had the right parents. My dad was in politics, and he was a member of the Senate, and he and Johnson were contemporary senators. And when Johnson was majority leader, my dad was whip of the Senate, and they were good friends. And actually, when LBJ had his heart attack in 1955, July of 1955, then my father took over as leader of the Senate until Johnson recovered and was back in business. So I knew the Johnsons as a family. My mother and Mrs. Johnson were friends. They weren't close friends. They were a little more than acquaintances. And we used to do some summer trips with the Johnson girls, who now, of course, I think of them as my contemporaries after all these years are passed, but then they were much, much younger. But we would go off to the beach together for the day in the summertime, and then the Johnsons had hamburgers in their backyard and would have other senators and families and so forth. So I knew them that way. And then when LBJ was running for president, I actually wasn't involved at all in that campaign, although my husband quit his job and jumped into the campaign. I was having a baby who, when he was born, I named him Lyndon. So when, after the campaign, after the convention, I was a volunteer down at the Democratic National Committee, and I ended up working in the Lyndon Johnson speechwriting office, which I was not a speechwriter. I was a speechwriter typist. It was pretty much of a worthless office, because Johnson only gave one speech during the campaign, and he gave it, and he gave it, and he gave it, and he gave it. And I always liked to be busy, and so there was mail coming in there to the Democratic Committee addressed to Senator Kennedy and Senator Johnson and Mrs. Kennedy, and some mail that was coming in addressed to Mrs. Johnson, and nobody was paying any attention to the mail addressed to Mrs. Johnson. So I started opening it and reading it, and I thought, well, you know, I'd been trained in a congressional office that when the mail comes in today, it's answered today. So I thought, well, I can answer this mail. So it was, people wanted to know, how do you feel about your husband running for vice president? Or you send me a recipe for my garden club cookbook, or such thing. What's your favorite color? Anyway, I printed up some stationery with their home address out on 30th place, and I typed the letters. I signed Lady Bird Johnson and stamped the mail and mailed it.
So, in the course of committing 3 federal offenses, you became the Social Secretary.
I did things I'd be in jail for today. Absolutely. But then she called me. I was working down at the inaugural committee then, and she called me. She was looking for the address of somebody, and I said, "Oh, Miss Johnson, how has your life changed?" And she said, "Oh, the mail. I don't know how I'm going to be able to keep up with the mail." And I thought, boing. So I had written her a letter on my IBM electric typewriter, and I just about to take it out of the typewriter to send to her when she called me on the phone and asked me. She said she had a present for the baby, and she wanted me to come and have lunch with her. And I took the letter with me, And I went to have lunch with her, and I got the present for the baby, and she asked me if I'd come and work for her. So I never gave her the letter. Nor did I ever tell her that I wrote all those letters. But another thing is that in those days, my handwriting was very much like hers. And it was discovered, particularly by her daughter Lucy, who was in school at National Cathedral School. And she didn't need a report card signed. She needed an excuse letter written to the headmistress explaining why she wasn't there. Well, I knew Mrs. Johnson would write the letter, but she wasn't there, and I was there, so I wrote the letter.
Talk about your relationships with the families, because obviously not everybody writes excuses for the family, or maybe they do. I want to talk to you, Ms. Nance, a little bit, because you had a teenage girl in the White House to deal with.
Two.
Well, you had two. You had one. And the family, because you say your job extended beyond just the First Lady. What was your relationship like with them, and what were your responsibilities with them? Because if I recall, there was a prom at the White House.
Susan had her prom there. Unfortunately, the prom took place just shortly before I went to work for Mrs. Ford. But she was just so wonderful in so many other ways. When her mother became ill, I would see her down in the driveway hosing down her car, wearing shorts or jeans or something. And then that evening she was subbing for her mother with these long white kid gloves on and meeting ambassadors and greeting everybody. It was pretty difficult for a girl. I think she was 16 at that time, going on 17. Susan really, she was really the only one home. Jack was home, but not too often. And Steve was out in California, so Susan was the one. And Mike, of course, had already left. Susan was the one. She continued. It must have been something that she really inherited from both parents. I was going to say her mother, but the president was a hard worker. But she just, she was always there and always willing to step in and do something, and that was very unusual from what I saw from a lot of my friends' children.
You talked about a wedding in Kennebunkport of Doro Bush that you worked with. Is that right?
Well, actually, it was at Camp David.
Camp David. It
And
made it a little more interesting because she married a Democratic staffer, if I remember. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Bobby Koch.
Yeah.
Cook. Sorry, it's spelled Koch. Bobby Cook. And but he's a wonderful man, and they've been very happy. And I don't know how the politics have sorted out, but that's not for us to worry about. But with the Bush White House, the Bushes had a huge family, and a huge extended family, because of course President Bush had 3 brothers and a sister and a mother living still when they were inaugurated, and then Barbara Bush had 2 brothers. And then you get all of those families, plus their spouses and their children, plus their children who were all married, and and then their children who are now the Bush's grandchildren, and they were 22 in number, plus this extended family. And so obviously there was a lot of activity when my first job at the Vice President's, and then again my first event at the White House the day after the inauguration was for the family. And the first one at the Vice President's was for about 50 or 70, I don't know. It was like, and so you'll have this party, and it's like, you know, that'll be 2 hours after we're inaugurated, and you're like, I don't know all the, you know, the ins and outs, but anyway, it did happen. And then at the White House, it was the next day, and there were about 150 at that one. So, but Camp David was very fun. Camp David was off limits, basically, for the staff. It is a place that the Bushes enjoyed going and sort of getting away from the Whitehouse hubbub and all the activities, and gave all of us a chance to have a breather before starting again Monday morning. And it was the perfect place for their daughter to get married because there was no press allowed, and she wanted a very small wedding. And we were able to do that in the chapel, and then a beautiful dinner outside. It was on the summertime, and it was the perfect spot. So, but that was unofficial. I did that just for them as a family friend, not as officially.
I want to ask a serious question for a moment, because at least two of you served in administrations that came to be under very, very strained circumstances. President Johnson taking over after the assassination of President Ford taking over after the resignation of a president. How did those times, not just those events, but the Vietnam War or any of the other events, how did those pressures affect the things you did? Did they impact your job and the way you approached things?
Well, the Johnsons moved into the White House at a very dark page in our history. And the Johnsons had told Mrs. Kennedy, stay here as long as you want, as long as you're comfortable in being here. Just stay in the house. Do not feel that you need to move. And Mrs. Kennedy had schools for the two little kids up on the third floor in the solarium. I had a nursery school and I guess a kindergarten maybe for Caroline. And she said, please have the kids' school stay there, because I know that's important. And the school kids stayed there, I think maybe through the semester. I think they were still there certainly in the part of the early spring. Mrs. Kennedy moved out and moved into Governor and Mrs. Harriman's house in Georgetown, and then subsequently bought a house across the street. But when the Johnsons moved into the house in probably the second week in December, the house was draped in black crepe over the doors. Black crepe wrapped the columns on the north and the south portico. All the chandeliers in the house were covered with black crepe. So, and it was like that for a month. And Mrs. Johnson said, you know, people look at the living and wish for the dead. And she was asked, I thought I was really annoyed at the question, but she was asked by a reporter who covered the White House. Now, Mrs. Johnson, what are you going to do in the White House, and what kind of entertaining are you going to do? And I remember two things that she said about that. She said, well, what I do in the White House is going to emerge in deeds, not talk. And then about entertaining in the White House, she said, this is just a wonderful house, and there are all these wonderful people who do things. And I've had to worry about that for 30 years. And now I'm so pleased that what I can do is I can worry about the guests. And I want to give everybody who comes to this house as our guest, I want to send them home with a treasured memory. And she was in Washington as the wife of a young congressman, and she had taken all these fabulous home movies. She was down there at the gate of the White House. She has movies of FDR coming out the gate, followed by the Secret Service car. She has pictures of the cherry blossoms. She has pictures of the Capitol. So I think that is, she was concerned about the guests, and she was concerned particularly about guests that were coming who were not particularly sophisticated. And on the day before, the day of a big dinner, a big function, she would be on the phone calling people that knew their way about. It might be a senator's wife, it might be a cabinet wife, it might be a member of the president's staff. And she said, now, Susie May is coming up here. She's from Rosebud, Texas, and she won't know a soul. And I want you to look for her and be sure that she has a good experience and has a good time. And I always thought that did two things. One, it made the lady who came up from Rosebud, Texas, it turned her into a star. And the person that Mrs. Johnson had asked her to do a favor for, it gave this person a reason to take this person around and introduce her to the cabinet member, the vice president, the movie star, and so forth. So that's what.
Ms. Downs, when you came into the White House, it was a bit after, if I understand the timeline, but nonetheless, President Ford came in very difficult circumstances, but he also came in, as you point out, at a time when the country was preparing for a huge celebration in 1976. Did those two worlds collide at all? Was there a certain reticence to do too much entertaining because of those circumstances?
The circumstances? No, not really, because well, first of all, I just going back a little bit, being in the White House at the time of that there was the change in presidents under such sad circumstances has to be just the most awful experience just for someone working there. And I watched it tear into Mrs. Ford and President Ford being on their staff there, and particularly the day of when the Nixons left the White House and when President Ford became president. And I just wondered, I said, how can they even stand up there, let alone assume all of these responsibilities? But it's just, I just really truly feel that the bicentennial and what I saw during the bicentennial year was so important to this country. It laid a lot of good groundwork, and we couldn't have had anybody better in the White House. And I think that the way that they conducted the celebration, yes, there were a lot of state dinners. Yes, there were a lot of, we not only had the bicentennial celebration that year, we had something called the Republican primary, when President Ford and Governor Reagan were in combat, let's say. Excuse me. And then after that, we had all of the time the state dinners and all of this wonderful entertaining was going on. Then we had the Republican National Convention and getting ready for that. And of course, Mrs. Ford, in her wisdom, was not going to let the ERA go by without being out there and championing her cause. And it was an outstanding year, but it just, one thing that she did that sounds rather mundane. Now, things have changed so much since they were president and first lady. And that's why I said it may sound mundane now, but she was so proud of everything about this country that she came up with an idea. It was what she called my Americana theme. And she wanted to show off everything that was great about America and the arts and the crafts and the antiques. And so we would call all the museums around the country, for example, when we knew President Sadat was coming, and we knew he was a very avid American Western fan. And we called I believe it was the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. They had the best collection of Remington and Russell bronzes. So I called and thought we're going to have to beg to get a couple of pieces from them. They sent us the entire collection. And so just pick, have her pick what she wants, and then, ship the rest back to us. And when that started, because she'd been in Washington as Mrs. Johnson for so many years, and I think they both went to so many events that it was fun to be there, but they really weren't much fun. And she also felt that by putting these objects in the center of a table, it would give people a conversation piece and also bring them together again. But the night of the Sadat dinner, I remember that clearly. He was so taken with the statues that after the dinner he said, "Can I walk around and take a look at the others?" And of course, she took him around the house. And I remember seeing, I think it was an interview with Mike Wallace that he did not too long before he was assassinated. And he was talking about the spirit of the American West and how much he wanted to lead his country down the same road in the same direction. And I remember saying to Mrs. Ford, "Now, isn't that, see what you did?" So those are, things. But the time of the exchange of the presidents was, I just hope nobody ever has to go through something like that again.
You both bring up very interesting points because both Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Ford had come up through the Congressional Wives rank. They knew the process. They knew a lot of folks. They were well connected. The Bushes, one of the campaign, and for those of you listening, I'm reciting a campaign slogan. I'm not making a political commentary. The Bush campaign used to like to refer to George Herbert Walker Bush as the most qualified man to be elected president. He had been liaison to China, had been head of the CIA, had been chairman of the Republican Party, and on and on and on. Been a member of the United States House of Representatives from Texas. He had run for Senate. He was defeated by Lloyd Bentsen. He'd been there. He'd done it. So it was different because you followed 2 terms as vice president into the White House, following in there, so it wasn't the same type of upheaval. How did the times affect your job as Social Secretary?
Well, I think the Bushes had certainly they wanted to put their own mark on, but I mean, we had 8 good years with Reagan, no question about that. But the Mideast, as it always has been, or seemingly has been and still is, was a big issue. So, I mean, eventually we did get into the Persian Gulf War. And, but Bush spent a lot of his time, and both he and Mrs. Bush understood the importance of entertaining. And social secretary, social entertaining, whatever you want to refer to it as, is really, it isn't just a social dinner like you think of having friends over. There is a reason, there's an agenda, and there's always a purpose for the dinner. And while Bush was president, we had 30 state dinners in 4 years. And that meant that we had almost one a month. And but he felt the importance because of these previous jobs he had held. And he loved doing that, and he loved entertaining. We must have entertained Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl and Turgut Özal of Turkey and Mitterrand of France and Canada, Mulroney. I mean, we had these people over and over again, and we went to their countries as well. But when the Persian Gulf War happened, we did hold off a bit on the entertaining. We, I know, canceled a couple state dinners, but then because it was a victory, we were right back at it, right afterwards. And
I'm running a little long because we want to get a couple of questions in from you in just a minute. So I'm going to start with you. I'm going to move down here. I'm saving you till the end because I want to know what the story is that you can tell me, and there are some that you can't, I'm sure, and I appreciate that. What's the story that you can tell me that was either the biggest disaster that you had as Social Secretary or the funniest thing involving the first family, the president, the first lady, something that we wouldn't expect?
Well, maybe the funniest, or sort of a semi-disaster, but not totally, was when President Salinas, I think these ladies have probably heard it because it seems to be one of the best stories from our administration, but President Salinas of Mexico, who was an Harvard educated, graduated from Harvard, and became president of Mexico, was invited to the White House for a state dinner. And you may have heard of Roland Meisner, the pastry chef, and he has a beautiful cookbook out. And he is a fabulous cook, no question. He did desserts that were spectacular. On that given evening, he had written down, we had done the menu, and he said he was going to do a dessert called the Mexican Fantasy. And since he always did spun sugar, and it went by, I looked at it, I said, great. Mrs. Bush looked at the menu as she always did. Oh, wonderful, I wonder what it's going to be. And so, but we weren't too concerned, and I tell you that we were having a lot of state dinners, so we didn't have him do a sample of every dessert. Well, on this occasion, the desserts, the pastry chef is, the pastry kitchen is on the lower level. They came up on the elevator to the pantry right before we send them out into the dining room. And I, as always, went over to admire them and tell him how wonderful they were and how beautiful they looked. Only they didn't look too good. And I sort of gasped and looked around, and I was like, is anybody seeing what I'm seeing? And everybody was just kind of looking. Nobody was commenting. And he had created this little marzipan adobe-looking house. And inside of it were fruits and berries, but you couldn't see that. And so it's very smooth, just like adobe, beautiful, only not the image that we were looking for. And next to him, next to the house, was a little siesta, a boy taking a siesta with his knees up and a big sombrero down like this, sleeping. Well, I knew this was going to be a disaster. It just couldn't happen. We just could not send it out. And it didn't matter that it had a little fence and beautiful flowers and everything. That was not going to work. So I said to Roland, we can't send this out. You can't do it. He said, oh, it is my creation. And he walks out, oh. And so I'm looking around saying, well, we can't do it. We've got to have a dessert. So anyway, there was a bowl of extra flowers, and as each tray went into the dining room, I plucked off the little Mexican boy taking a siesta and jammed in a flower. So it didn't look great, but it was okay. Well, now I watch as it goes to Mrs. Bush's table, because she always made a big fanfare about how beautiful the desserts were and wanted, everybody to rave over Roland's efforts. She took one look at it and totally picked up on it, picked up the spoon, never showed it to anybody, and just smashed the house. The fruit and flour, all of that spilling out. It just looked like a mess. But, it was so much better than what it would have looked like. But those are sort of the little finer details that are responsibilities, I think, of the social secretary. I mean, it is a diplomatic event, and I just knew that it was going to be awful. So the next morning, of course, Roland came into my office threatening to resign and, so offended and so incensed. And anyway, we kind of talked it out and decided that in the future we would not do anything that was directly to any culture and we would just make it very American after that.
Did the press ever pick up on that at the time?
No.
Congratulations. Ms. Downs, what would your disaster or funniest thing that happened while you were there?
My disaster went on all evening. Unfortunately, during the Queen's visit, during the bicentennial, when Her Majesty and Prince Philip came over, that afternoon around 5:30 or 6 o'clock, the dinner was in the Rose Garden. And we held all of the bicentennial dinners, or most of them, in the Rose Garden because Mrs. Ford did not want to close the house down to the visitors during the day. So we were in there all afternoon and had all the tables set and the flowers and everything. And around 5:30, it started to rain and sleet and everything. And this was in June. And all of a sudden, trees started coming down. We lost 7 trees on the Whitehouse grounds that night. That's how bad the storm was. I thought, oh my God, I don't want to go to the Rose Garden and see what's happened to the tent. It was under a beautiful white tent. And I got down there, and Dick Cheney, God love him, he was our chief of staff, had realized what was happening, and he called everybody from the West Wing, and they were all down there holding down tables and taking flowers off and everything. So then we managed to get through that, and the sun came out. I thought, okay, this is fine. The Queen and Philip arrived. Mrs. Ford and the President greeted them in the portico, escorted them in, and the routine was that they would take them upstairs to the Yellow Oval Room for an aperitif before coming down to the receiving line. And it was a very small elevator leading up to the Yellow Oval. And I didn't see it, but Mrs. Ford came down looking a little pale around the gills, and she said, oh my God, Maria, she said, the elevator door opened, and there was Jack, her son Jack, in all of his glory. No shirt, no shoes or socks on. He was looking for his cufflinks. He was going to the dinner that night, and he said, oh my God, and ran away. And Mrs. Ford turned to the Queen and said, Your Majesty, I apologize. And the Queen said, think nothing of it. I have one just like it at home. So after, for the longest time, we kept calling Jack it. But that wasn't the end. We went into the dinner was pretty good, a few minor mishaps. And then we got to the infamous entertainment. Well, Mrs. Ford had made a really concerted effort to find entertainment that the Queen and Philip would enjoy, and she knew how much they both loved Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, and they were very appropriate, Bob being a native, and Bing was playing over at the Palladium at that time to record crowds, and they were just personal friends, actually. And somewhere betwixt and between, I guess you don't always get what you ask for. We ended up with Bob Hope, of course, but instead of Bing, we had the Captain and Tennille. And at that point, the Captain and Tennille had a hit record out. I don't know if you remember it, called Help Me.
Muskrat Love, yeah.
I wanna,
You don't know how embarrassed I am. I remember that.
I just put it out of my mind. It's like, anyway, they're sitting there and they're, listening to these two chipmunks make love, and I thought, I don't want to look at the Queen. But she and Philip are sitting there laughing away. And I thought, oh no. Well, anyway, that was. After that, they went out on the into the stateroom for the dancing after dinner, and everything was going fine until the President decided to escort the Queen onto the dance floor, and the Marine Band struck up "The Lady is a Tramp." And I thought, I'm going home, I'm never coming back, and they won't let me in. No, but seriously, I asked President Ford afterward, not that evening, of course, afterwards, I said, did she realize what music was being played? And he said, oh, yes. I said, did she say anything? And he said, oh, no. And I said, did you say anything? And he said, oh, no. And we all lived happily ever after.
That's wonderful. Ms. Abell, before we go to a couple of questions from the audience, I do apologize we've run long. I knew I would because I get enthralled with these stories. Tell me about the Johnson Whitehouse story that you found the most humorous or perhaps the biggest disaster, other than...
How many do you want?
Well, I've got to do the news at 10.
Well, as Laurie said, there were certain countries that came on a regular basis. The Japanese, the Italians, the British, the Canadians. And the British Prime Minister seemed to come, once a month. Anyway, Prime Minister Wilson was en route. I think the notice for this came about 5 days ahead of time. I remember originally when I went to work at the White House, I read something in the Emily Post that said, if you're invited to a dinner at the White House, your invitation will arrive generally by messenger 6 weeks ahead of time. Well, 6 weeks ahead of time, we didn't know what might be happening. So a lot of our invitations, I suppose today, they're probably sent out by email. But in those days, they were sent out by wire or by telephone. And then, of course, a lovely formal invitation would follow with your name filled in with the beautiful calligraphy. But Prime Minister Wilson was coming, and so he asked Henry Howard to come up with the menu. And I called, I thought, what can we do for the entertainment? Oh, I know, I'm going to call Bob Merrill. He was the baritone at the Metropolitan Opera, and he had been at the White House a number of times. His wife, Miriam, was his accompanist, so they knew the drill, and it would be easy. So I telephoned Bob, and I said, any chance you're free on X date? And he said, yeah, I can do that. I can rearrange a rehearsal, and I'll be there. I said, terrific. When you get the program outline that you want to sing, just phone the office, and we'll have the program printed and put out the press release. So he called in. I didn't pay any attention to the songs that he was going to sing. I took them down to Liz Carpenter's office, and she sent out the press release. And the calligraphy office was doing us a lovely program that would be given to all the guests. And then maybe the morning before the dinner, my telephone rang about the same time the Washington Post hit the front door. And it was Walt Rostow calling. Walt was then the president's national security advisor. And he said, you cannot be serious. You can't sing for the Prime Minister that just announced a pullout of troops east of Suez. You cannot sing On the Road to Mandalay. And you cannot sing for the Prime Minister that's just announced the devaluation of the British pound. I got plenty of nothing. So I'm on my high horse and making the speech about this is art, this is not politics. Well, we can all tell you that everything that happens in that house is politics. So I immediately called Bob Merrill and I said, don't answer your phone. Tell me the number of your next door neighbor. I will call them if I need to reach you. But this is what's happened. And so bring all that music with you. I don't know what's going to happen, but give me a new program and we'll have another program printed up, and then we'll know more when you arrive. So after the arrival ceremony on the South Lawn, which is lovely with trumpets and military uniforms and speeches, and that was also one of the places. Was that when the Queen came and you couldn't see her?
Oh, that was ours, the
You
Queen,
could
the
just
talking
see her
hat.
We're Queen.
The hat arrived at the White House. Anyway, they are wonderful ceremonies and very colorful, and a lot of people like to come and get close to them and see them and so forth. And then after the speeches, the president and his visitor go into the diplomatic reception room and shake hands with a lot of people. And then the president and his visitor usually go over to the president's office to begin their negotiations. Well, the first of the negotiations, before they even left the diplomatic reception room, were between Prime Minister Wilson and President Johnson, had to do with Bob Merrill's program. Because there were just killing cartoons about Prime Minister Wilson, what the Americans think of him. So he had known through the British ambassador that there was a possibility that we could change the program. And these would be the new songs. I can't remember what they were. But then the Prime Minister told me, he said, I can survive almost anything, but don't change the program. That would really kill me. So Bob Merrill played the regular program, and then at the end, he did an encore. It ain't necessarily so.
Ladies, I would stay here for 3 or 4 more hours, and I love these stories, but we do have some time frame. And Elaine, I'm running a little, can I take a couple of questions? I'd like to take a couple from the, I am running long, I apologize. Anybody with a really quick one, right? We got a microphone we can get over here? Or if you'll stand up, I can just repeat it so everybody can hear it.
Yes, I was just wondering if one of your guests could very quickly take us through the planning and execution of the state dinner.
Quickly?
I don't hear the question. I'm deaf, and I can't hear the question.
They wanted you to quickly explain the planning of a state dinner. I don't know if you can do that quickly, but let's rephrase it. How long does it take? I mean,
Well, it takes as long as you have. The guest list in my day came from the State Department initially, and it would come with the list of the foreign party on it, and they would have business people on the list who were involved in business in the incoming countries, anyway, mining or whatever in their country. And then they would always have the chairman and the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs and the Foreign Relations Committee. And those I would usually scratch off because I just went to the president's congressional staff and said, here's who's coming, who do you want this time? And they kept track of who they wanted, what House members, what senators, because that was part of their business. And then the person in the White House who dealt with labor leaders, I would call him. In this case, I think they were mostly all hims. Call him and ask him, I said, I need 3 labor leaders for this country, this dinner. And then in my office, we would come up with the sparklies, which were the authors, the movie stars, the singers, the movie people, and whatever. And what else? Oh, then we had a group for African Americans. We always had so many black guests. And we had about 3 university presidents. And of course, we had to have people who had given money to the Democratic Party.
And likely people from Texas too, right?
What?
You had to have people from Texas too.
Well, there were a lot of friends from Texas. There were a lot of friends from Texas who gave money.
Yeah, well, there you go.
So I'd call Cliff Carter over at the Democratic Committee, and I'd say, give me whatever, six couples for this dinner. And he would send me a list of 30. And I'd say, Cliff, look, these these big givers see each other at the big Democratic dinners. They don't want to come to the White House and see each other. They want to come here and see the vice president and the cabinet member and the movie stars. So we finally got that scaled down. Now, what other groups?
Academia and religious
Well, the
leaders we
university.
used to have. Press, some press people.
Oh yes, we always had either Liz Carpenter and the president press secretary got together on
Henry
a press-
Kissinger's suggestion. Henry Kissinger's suggestions I always had, and I always accused him of saving the best people for the luncheon that he always had at State Department the next day. He still hasn't forgiven me. But
putting
here's a little-
together the list was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
Let me read this because I wrote it down because I wouldn't garble it up. Okay, when putting together a guest list for the President and First Lady, you include those who he had to be sure to invite people who should be invited, soothe those who are not invited but think they should be invited, and don't invite the people who should not be invited. And that led to warfare.
Now, I want to tell you, I do want to tell you a story about the King of Norway was coming. And a friend of mine who worked in the State Department called me, and he said that he had a really great idea of how to make this dinner for the King of Norway a smashing success. My friend was of Norwegian descent from Minnesota. So I said, well, come by. I'd like to hear about it. Any ideas? Great. Well, he came by, and it turned out that the way to make the dinner a really big success was for he and his wife to come, to be invited to the dinner. And I said, Howard, the dinner's just oversubscribed. There's no way that we can fit you in. We've already invited too many people. And he said, well, no one is supposed to know this. No one is supposed to know this, but Mary is dying. She has just probably 6 weeks to live. And it would just be so meaningful to her to be invited to this dinner for the King of Norway. And I said, oh, Howard, I'm so sad about this and thinking about those lovely little children Mary's going to leave behind for you. So I told Mrs. Johnson the sad story, and I said, if it's okay with you, I'm going to watch the list, and if it turns out that there is space, or if I can uninvite somebody, which sometimes I did to make room, is it okay if I stick on the Hoggeroots? Because they weren't up in that echelon in the State Department to even it'd be appropriate for them to be invited to this dinner. So anyway, they were invited to the dinner. They did come. They had a wonderful time. And I still occasionally see Mary. Sometimes you're just had.
Ladies, before Elaine does, thank you for spending this time with me. I've enjoyed it.
Having had the pleasure of getting to know Maria over my time here, I and my colleagues have heard some of her stories, but I have to say these are wonderful additions. These are all true stories, and they could even talk to you about how they don't set out the place cards for the seating charts at the dinner until 30 minutes before the dinner, because the haranguing and the politicking of who is going to be added on and who's suddenly in town, and they have wonderful stories. So I think you're going to have a fun time talking with them this evening. Thank you all so much for these presentations. And I'm going to keep you on stage, but I have some presents here for each of you. And I'll just come behind, Rick,
Thank you.
for you.
Thank you very much.
We have signed pen sets with the signature of Gerald R. Ford
Thank
as
you.
mementos. So you don't need the
Thank you.
pen that you have back. And then Laurie, we have for you a letter from Mrs.
Oh,
Ford. and
great.
Maria.
Thank you.
For you.
Thank you.
So we
Thank
thank
you.
you so
Thank
much,
you.
and we hope
Thank you.
those will be useful. Before we go
Oh,
to
wow.
our reception, I want to again remind you that tomorrow is Mrs. Ford's 91st birthday. Her daughter Susan is there with her now. We will have free admission and cake for the first 750 who come tomorrow. And I can guarantee you that when I'm up in the morning in the Amway, there will be people lined up outside the front door of the museum before 9 o'clock to be the first to get the cake. Looking ahead to next week, Tuesday evening, the 14th, the night before our taxes are due, think of it that way, John Schwartzlows is the director of the Betty Ford Center in Palm Springs, California. He's a wonderful person. He'll be talking about the Betty Ford Center and has chosen a title called Betty Ford, A Love Story, because of her very deep commitment and support for creating the center and then, of course, supporting it and helping it to grow. So he has worked with Mrs. Ford through the entire 25 years the center has existed. And so that's a really special presentation. Looking ahead, the week after, over in Ann Arbor at the library, we're having William Seidman, who is known to many of you, who was in the Ford administration and now is a commentator on financial issues for CNBC. The topic of his talk is the U.S. economy, what's ahead, and I think he's rather well suited to be talking with us about that. So I hope you can make all of those programs. Tonight I want to give thanks to the Ford Foundation, as I always do. That is the primary, and frankly not just primary, the sole source for support for our public programs. Our federal budget basically pays heat, light, and staff salaries, and it's the foundation, the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, that provides all of the money for the bringing in our speakers, providing a reception, and so forth. So we hope that as you're here tonight, if you're not already a friend of Ford, that you'll consider joining us. The foundation has a new executive director, and that is Joe Calvaruso. And Donna, also stand Donna Calvaruso, his wife. Joe's been with us 3 months. So make sure you have a chance to meet Joe. He's got a million ideas and is working very, very hard, starting a lot of good things, and we're really glad to have him aboard. Marty Allen, our chair emeritus, is here with us as well, and Marty has been a wonderful support through the 27 years that we've been in existence. Going back to Friends of Ford for a moment, if you join tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we have a special opportunity for you. If you join tonight at the level of $250 membership or more, you can have a free copy of Betty Ford's book, Glad Awakening, which is signed by Mrs. Ford. And if you join at the cabinet level, which is $1,000, you can have a signed copy of President Ford's book, A Time to Heal. So those are specials for tonight and tomorrow only. So please give that consideration. And now we hope you'll join us in the lobby, meet our speakers, and take a look at the White House in miniature upstairs. And again, we thank you all for coming. We're glad to have you with us.